We have the Ayatollah of fantasy rock and roll with us today, Adam Rank. How you doing, Rank?
They look great in person, and I just can't wait to next year where we can pack it full of 25,000.
Hey, Bob, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great. I didn't know it was Ball Guys Day. It was being ranked. I mean, how can you lose?
This is the Dynasty Vipers ViperCast.
Hello and welcome to the Dynasty Vipers ViperCast. This is episode 130, presented by the Fantasy Points Media Group. And by the sounds of it already, my audio is 100% better, and it does not sound like my head is stuck in a toilet this week. So please welcome to the show today, the one and only Evan Silva. How are you doing, Evan?
Matt, it is good to be with you. I love that intro. Great graphics, great sound. Excellent, man. Great stuff.
Well, we're all about faking it until you make it over here. So we try to make it look a little bit good, kind of present it, kind of fool people into thinking we know what we're doing, and then we hit them with the show usually. So hopefully we bring people in with the graphics, the video, all this fun stuff, little smoke and mirrors. That's kind of how we go with everything. But speaking of those smoke and mirrors, I mean, we're going to talk about some boom and bust players heading into 2022. And if you are listening to us for the first time, stay tuned, because every show here, not only do we do a little bit of football talk because we're contractually obligated to do so, but then we will go behind the grind with Evan and kind of talk about his career, how we got to where he is today in the industry. And that's always a treat for us to go into. But let's dive right into this boom and bust players. Now, recently you kind of released your top 150 players, and you got a lot of players that kind of differ from what the consensus may be. But let's talk about these players that kind of differ a little bit from where the consensus have it, see if we can identify some potential boom and busts heading into 2022.
All right. Sounds good to me.
So at the quarterback position in particular, I mean, this is, if you're in a one QB league, if you don't have one quarterback, you're done. I mean, we know there's depth at the position. You can kind of wait on a quarterback here and there. So who are some quarterbacks that maybe we can wait on that are going to give us that boom type potential?
Well, last year that guy was Jalen Hurts, who wound up being one of the most consistent quarterbacks in fantasy over the course of the year, and also provided you with upside. And that's really what we're looking for at the position, guys who can give you high floors and high ceilings, whether it be playing in Dynasty, super flex, daily fantasy. That's what we're looking for on a consistent basis. So we're kind of trying to find that, who could be that next Jalen Hurts this year. I would say one guy that, isn't nearly as has been more prominent, than Jalen Hurts, obviously, is Russell Wilson. He's going to a really positive situation from a weapon standpoint in Denver. Also people in the league really have never regarded Russell Wilson as a player that they wanted to let open up the offense. And that's why it took so long for them to let Russ cook. And then they did it for 10 weeks during a particular season. And then after he had, a bevy of interceptions, they reeled it back. And last year they were ground and pound again. Will the Denver coaches open it up for him, because they certainly have the weapons around him to do it? I think if we're looking for, a guy that could potentially be, productive because he is a dual threat. I mean, Marcus Mariota early in the season will be a guy to monitor. And quarterbacks that can run, obviously, have been taking over the position. And that's why we saw Jalen Hurts in large part have so much success last year. It wasn't necessarily for his passing, but now he has those weapons to potentially prop him up and take another step forward. I have him actually right now as my overall quarterback 3 ahead of Patrick Mahomes.
I like that. I mean, we talk about this, the running potential and everything that kind of comes into it. Before he kind of tailed off towards the end of last year a little bit, he was putting up top 5 quarterback numbers each and every week last week. So that's something we can't forget about. I know you mentioned Mahomes there. We mentioned Russell Wilson. We might as well throw Justin Herbert's name in there when we talk about these quarterbacks, especially in that AFC West. Derek Carr is probably one of the most underrated quarterbacks in the league. at the end of the day, whenever it comes down to somehow he's in that QB 12 to 14 range when the dust all settles. Now, this AFC West, have the moves in this offseason, especially at the pass rush, kind of changed the way we think about how these quarterbacks can produce in 2022?
Yeah, I mean, I think that these teams. Well, I think from a real life standpoint, those teams are just going to beat up on each other. And that may have some impact on the fantasy box score. I think the bigger concern, like for Patrick Mahomes, for instance, because their offensive line really came together and gelled, especially down the stretch last year. I think that they're going to be in good hands from a protection standpoint. But the age is starting to pile up on Travis Kelce, and Tyreek Hill is gone. With Derek Carr, he added Devante Adams, but is Devante Adams going to be the same without Aaron Rodgers? And I think we can confidently say that we know that that's a big upgrade for the Raiders, but will Derek Carr be able to unlock him like Aaron? I mean, those guys had incredible chemistry, especially on those comebacks, the downfield sideline, 50-50 balls. I mean, Aaron could put it right where Devante Adams needed it. And will Derek Carr be able to do that? Probably not to the same extent.
And then let's talk about quarterbacks that maybe the consensus is much higher than you are on this. Who's that quarterback that you're probably avoiding for the most part in fantasy football?
Well, it tends to be quarterbacks that just go early. There's always a guy that's going to, take a chance on a quarterback like late in the second round, or of like a traditional season-long draft. So that's kind of the guy that I'm avoiding. I'm open to drafting like a lot of quarterbacks. I mean, because I'm willing to wait. So a lot of quarterbacks are going to go off the board before I draft one, typically. And so I'm trying to identify that again. That Jalen Hurts, that guy that last year you can consistently get him in like the 10th to 13th round after most of the teams in the draft have already selected their quarterback.
Do we think that maybe Trey Lance can be that guy this year? Do we think Shanahan's going to give him that opportunity?
He can, but there are serious concerns, I think, about Trey Lance. I mean, the 49ers were extremely cautious to turn the keys over to him last year when he did play. They put the guardrails on him. I mean, they didn't give him a whole lot, and Jimmy Garoppolo is still there. And I don't know if Jimmy Garoppolo is going to get traded. I mean, it sounded like the 49ers were asking too much. The rest of the league didn't want to pay that, especially for a guy who's coming off like a serious shoulder surgery. But I mean, hey, as long as he's still there, they know that they can win with Jimmy Garoppolo. I mean, they went to the freaking Super Bowl with Jimmy Garoppolo, So that's the big concern right now for Trey Lance. But I do think that once Trey Lance gets in there, he could be really good in fantasy. There was one rumor that one of the reasons that Deebo Samuel wanted out is because he didn't want to play with Trey Lance. At least that's part of it.
And that could change the dynamic, that role that Deebo has moving forward, depending on that quarterback under center. We know Trey Lance likes to run the ball, which means Deebo Samuel's probably not getting those extra touches that he likes. I mean, he's still a receiver at heart. No matter how you look at him, there's always that kind of that diva tag attached to the wide receiver position. Now, you kind of talked about the tight end position a little bit there. Travis Kelce getting a little bit older. He's still one of those top three tight ends, no matter how you want to look at it going into 2022. Mark Andrews, Kyle Pitts, et cetera, et cetera. Who's one of those tight ends that you're higher on, and who's a tight end that you're a little bit lower on when we're looking for these boom bust potentials at that position? Because we know the tight end position was an absolute wasteland for fantasy last year.
Yeah.
And actually, it's been a wasteland for the last few years.
Yeah, it absolutely has. I mean, last year, a guy that we were higher on than consensus was Mark Andrews. He wound up being the overall tight end one. So we're kind of looking for a guy that could enter that range. I mean, like Dalton Schultz, I think is actually already in that range right now. And people are drafting him aggressively. But I support that. I mean, he's got more opportunity this year in Dallas. Can a guy like Robert Tonyan in Green Bay take a step forward? Because there's a lot more opportunity in Green Bay right now. I mean, atop their depth chart at wide receiver is, Alan Lazard and, a rookie from North Dakota State and, maybe Sammy Watkins. And I mean, not a star-studded receiver core there in Green Bay. Can Robert Tonyan step up and take that next step? I mean, we know he can score touchdowns. He's really good in the red zone. Rodgers trusts him there. And he's always been a good athlete.
Can we see Logan Thomas rise again from the ashes this year, especially with a quarterback like Carson Wentz, who kind of needs that big type wide receiver to make him a little bit, dare I say, a little bit more accurate?
Right. I mean, Carson Wentz, not my favorite real life quarterback, but he's good enough, kind of like Jared Goff to some extent. He's good enough to get the ball to his guys. I mean, Logan Thomas can have a chance, and it's going to come down to, Carson Wentz has one of his strengths has been his willingness to throw the ball into coverage. Like, he's willing to trust his receivers. Having a big receiver like Logan Thomas, I mean, they could find chemistry, no doubt.
So let's move along to the wide receiver position here, because we know every year, I think last year, there was 13 1,000-yard receivers that kind of came out of the woodwork. Some that we were expecting, some that we weren't. But when you look at receivers who've put back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons and back-to-back 10-plus touchdowns the last couple of years, that list is considerably smaller. And I think it starts and ends with Devante Adams here. Mm-hmm. So what receivers are we maybe overhyping right now as we're heading into these training camp battles here in the next couple months? And who are some guys that we need to be keeping an eye on, because they could come out of nowhere and surprise a few people?
Yeah, well, I'm below consensus on Devante Adams. I mean, we have a somewhat aging receiver, changing offenses, changing quarterbacks, and really has a lot more target competition with Las Vegas than he did in Green Bay. I mean, Darren Waller and Hunter Renfrow are legit, target commanders, and Devante Adams he's not going to see as many targets as he did. And then what will his efficiency be? Downgrading from Aaron Rodgers to Derek Carr. So I think that he's at the top of that list. The guys in Seattle are tough to rank right now, because you want to bet on DK Metcalf's talent, but the quarterback downgrade there is scary, and the complexion of the offense is scary, because it sounds like they want to go back to ground and pound, with Kenneth Walker and Rashad Penny. And Tyler Lockett is such a baller, but ripping away Russell Wilson from him. I found myself ranking those guys higher than consensus initially, actually, and I think I'm going to have to reel them back, because there's just too many concerns. I actually agree with the crowd on the Seahawks receivers.
Well, I think Seattle's receivers compare very favorable to the Denver Broncos wide receivers, especially when we're evaluating that Seattle team as far as fantasy is concerned. We've seen what Lockett doesn't do with Geno Smith. We've seen Metcalf have a small degree of success with Geno under center last year.
Small Lockett size, but yeah.
Yeah, Lockett completely disappeared. And then if we want to kind of look at Drew Lock and what he was able to do with Cortland Sutton and Jerry Jeudy, there was not a whole heck of a lot. In fact, when Jerry Jeudy came back, that entire Broncos pass catching group basically disappeared with Lock under center. So, I mean, I get it. There's not a whole lot that you want to bet on these guys. I mean, these are guys you could be taking early as your wide receiver twos, maybe in fantasy, but there's a whole lot of, you're a little apprehensive about actually pulling that pin there when it comes to the draft itself. Now, I love to add that injury tag and veteran presence kind of guys. So some guys I kind of want your opinion on here right now is, first off, the newest Arizona wide receiver in Marquis Hollywood Brown. I mean, he kind of got a bad rap there a little bit last year, a little bit of a nagging injury situation. DeAndre Hopkins is going to be suspended for the first 6 games of the year. You got guys like Rondale Moore that we want to believe in, but apparently no one in Arizona believes in him. And then you have AJ Green, who just happens to still be kicking it around. What do we see for the outcome for Marquise Brown?
Yeah, and I mean, I like the fact that Kyler Murray and Marquise Brown spent 2 years together at Oklahoma. So there has to be some level of chemistry there that hopefully they can rekindle. I mean, DeAndre Hopkins out for the first 6 games. Christian Kirk is gone. Rondale Moore, he's a tough guy to project going into year 2. I want to be on the optimistic side of him. Kyler Murray throws the ball best outside the numbers. He's a short quarterback, and he's not great at throwing the ball, over the offensive line into the middle of the field. that's where he makes so much of his money as a runner. He's not as great of a thrower. He's really good throwing the ball outside the numbers. So, and I think Marquise Brown can win outside the numbers. He had a really good season last year, except for like 4 glaring end zone drops, 3 of which occurred in the same game. But otherwise, I mean, he was pretty darn good last year. I mean, I think I think he's slowly but steadily taken a step forward each season of his NFL career. And I mean, I thought he took a fairly significant step forward last year. But I think he's going to be a little streaky in Arizona.
And I just kind of want to touch back on here a couple of players here I've been kind of eyeing. We know the Deebo Samuel situation is what it is. Can Brandon Ayuk kind of regain the confidence of fantasy managers in 2022? I mean, we've seen him have success there when Kittle went down a couple of years ago. And then last year there was a slow start. And then we've seen him kind of get it together towards the end. If Deebo is not there, if he's holding out or whatever that situation looks like, by the way, I don't think he's going to hold out. I don't think he really has a whole lot of ability to do so when it's all said and done. But is Ayuk a guy that maybe you can get a little bit later in drafts that could definitely pay off?
Yeah, he's another kind of tough guy where I kind of want to get to training camp before I take a real strong stand on Brandon Ayuk. Does he? Because I think there was some behind the scenes stuff there with the coaches last year, because when he came out of the gates, like he wasn't a starter. He at one point they like announced that Trent Sherfield was going to start over him, and it was like, what is going on? He finally did start getting going in the second half of the season. He's got a ton of talent, so good with the ball in his hands. It really fits the offense in San Francisco, but the Trey Lance factor, is looms large here as well. You have a lot of talent in the skill position core in San Francisco. You don't have a ton of pass volume to begin with, even with Jimmy Garoppolo. And I think you'd have a less pass volume with Trey Lance. So those are the big concerns. I mean, we know that Brandon Ayuk can play. It's just, is that volume going to be there for him, especially assuming that Deebo comes back and you got George Kittle and, just not a ton of pie to go around in the first place.
Especially with Trey Lance throwing that ball or running the ball, taking away those extra touches. Now, I have a type. When we go into rookie drafts, I have a type. When I evaluate these draft prospects, I like myself a big physical specimen. But you know as well as I do, these big receivers, they have a lot of boom and bust potential to them. And we've heard it all draft process. We heard the whole Drake London, Treylon Burks. One's going to hit, one might not hit, because the chances are when you got receivers like this, they're not all going to hit. You could throw in Alec Pierce and you could throw in Christian Watkins. I saw him on your guys' show. He's got all kinds of ranges of outcome. He could be a wide receiver one in Green Bay, but there's a lot of red flags that we need to look at. Right. Are any of these guys going to be an absolute boom in year one? Or are we kind of looking at more of a wait and see approach with all 4 of these big wide receivers?
Well, I just got Treylon Burks in my most recent rookie draft, so I'm a little bit biased here. I'll be pulling for Treylon Burks to be that guy. And I tend to think that he's got the best chance just because there's so much opportunity in Tennessee. Now, this is another team that doesn't have a big passing volume pie. But, his number one competition for targets is Robert Woods coming off a torn ACL. Robert Woods is a good player when he's healthy, but he's coming off that injury and he's getting a little older himself. Treylon Burks, I think that what he did well in college was win in high percentage on high percentage stuff. And I think that he's got a chance that they may funnel offense through him in the same way that they did for him in college.
I love Treylon Burks as a player because he went to Arkansas, played in the SEC, and he absolutely made Alabama look silly. When you are the best player on a really bad team and everyone knows that you're going to get the ball, but they can't stop you, that's probably going to transition pretty good at the next level. Now, we want to talk about running backs here before we get into the behind the grind here. Who are some boom and bust type running backs we're heading into 2022?
Well, I think clearly the biggest one is Kenneth Walker, because there's a large range of outcomes here. Where they took him in the draft, I think it was number 41. That indicates to me that they see him as a bell cow, but they also did give Rashad Penny a decent amount of money on his 1-year deal. I think a little over $5 million. And Rashad Penny was awesome in the second half of last year. And I mean that, it's not, I feel like people are assuming that Kenneth Walker is going to just run away with this. And I mean, based on the way that Rashad Penny played last year, I mean, why wouldn't Rashad Penny start? And people are just relying a little bit too much on the draft status. Like, who doesn't give as much of a care about draft status is Pete Carroll. He will play the better player, and Rashad Penny, I think, might be the better player. I mean, we also don't have a big sample size on Kenneth Walker from a receiving standpoint, and the offense could be really bad, really for a long time. I mean, if we're talking about Dynasty, we're thinking about like long term, like this Seattle offense could be bad for a really long time, And so, and I mean, some people say, "Oh, they're tanking." I don't think that Pete Carroll is trying to tank. And even if they play hard, they end up winning like 7 games, and they're not in position for that early round, that super high, top 5 quarterback next year. I mean, this could be a disaster. When you get rid of like a franchise legend like that, you're taking a really big risk. And I'm talking about Russell Wilson, obviously, trading away a guy like that, and a homegrown talent. I mean, they stole him in the draft. I hated that move. I think that when you have a player like that, you make sure that he retires with your team. And I think that it's almost like bad karma for them.
It is. And the other bad karma type situation is drafting a guy like Ramondre Stevenson when Damian Harris is clearly the back in New England. I mean, New England, they must have this weird crush on Damian Harris. Does he repeat what he did last year? Is Ramondre Stevenson going to get any play, or do they really love Harris this much where he's going to get all the goal line work? Where Harris is going right now RB22, RB23 in a lot of drafts. Is he one of those guys that could possibly boom in 2022 that we're just not maybe respecting enough because New England sure loves him?
I mean, well, they did just draft not only Ramondre Stevenson last year, but then they drafted 2 more running backs this year. So I don't know. Do they really love Damian Harris? I mean, he fumbled quite a bit last year. Bill Belichick, they would often go right back to him after fumbles. Stephen Ridley didn't get those opportunities back in the day. Damian Harris was getting them. But also, there were points at which Ramondre Stevenson had rendered the backfield a 2-man ordeal, and they were using both of them. And in an offense where, they're not throwing to those backs very often, you've got James White is returning and then 2 rookies. No, I don't think that this is Damian Harris's year. I don't.
And then speaking of running backs that maybe weren't helped out in the draft, what about Antonio Gibson's ranges of outcome here in 2022, especially with Brian Robinson coming back? Brian Robinson, a very patient runner. He sat behind Najee Harris there for 2 years in Alabama. When given that opportunity, he excelled. Antonio Gibson, he's only been playing running back for 2-3 seasons already. So he's not a guy who's been playing a whole lot of running back, but that cannot be a good indication off the get-go. Maybe it's more of a health thing or whatnot. But I mean, if I'm Antonio Gibson, I'm looking over my shoulder.
Yeah, I mean, geez, this has been not a good offseason for Antonio Gibson. First J.D. McKissick comes back, and that guy, I mean, they love to throw to him in the passing game. And so, and that was like the strength of Antonio Gibson coming out of Memphis, that he was, a receiving back. And he hasn't been very efficient, just leaves a lot of yards on the field as a runner. He's got a lot of talent as a runner, but he leaves a lot of yards on the field. They bring in another interior runner in Brian Robinson, and they use legit draft capital on him, a 3rd-round pick. And this has been it's not good. I mean, it'll be interesting to see. I would like to see them use Antonio Gibson as more of like a manufactured touch player, where he's getting maybe 7 carries and 6 targets a game. Because right now he's like in limbo.
Maybe you could basically turn him into maybe you could turn him into Deebo Samuel Light,
right,
so to speak. A lot of the same type situation there. Now, I love myself a free space in fantasy football. Now, the trick is trying to identify that free space. I'm looking at the Miami Dolphins backfield here right now because you can get any of these running backs way on the back end of your fantasy football drafts. You've got Chase Edmonds getting paid as an RB1. You got Raheem Mostert, who's very familiar with the system. And then you got Sony Michel, who just won't go away anywhere. I kind of like Sony Michel as a guy you're going to get way later. I think Mostert and Edmonds are going to go ahead of them clearly in fantasy football drafts, but where do you see this backfield shaping up, and is there value in either one of these backs?
This is kind of a stay away situation unless Chase Edmonds falls like 2 rounds below his ADP, I think, because you have Mike McDaniel coming from the Kyle Shanahan background where they, tend to use multiple backs. And you just have so many guys. Raheem Mostert's familiar with the offense. Chase Edmonds got the money. Sony Michel has won 2 Super Bowls. I say that kind of tongue in cheek. But, there's a bunch of guys there. Myles Gaskin's still there. And how good is the offense going to be? I don't know. I feel like it's going to run so much through Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, and to a lesser extent, Mike Gesicki. It's just I don't think there's I don't think there's really any value here.
Well, I can tell you exactly where there's value. Maybe the Dolphins cannot establish the run, but I know you and the crew over there at Establish the Run have a pretty good value going on here with the 2022 draft kit. Kind of just tell us everything that you're going to get there, because I know your top 150 tiers and drafting, that's all there, but there's so much more in this little package.
Yeah, I'm writing the tiers up right now. I have the traditional sleepers and bust stuff, but we got Michael Leone and Anthony Amico and Adam Levitan writing articles constantly. It's constantly updated. During training camp, I go on my update log every day, and you can see the movement in the top 150 every single day. I mean, because something will happen every day, that translates to changes in rankings. And then we do podcasts to kind of explain in more fully detail about the changes each and every week. So it's updated in real time, and I think people really like it, especially if you're playing really any kind of format, best ball. If you want to jump into some high stakes stuff, we have like promo codes for that to play in the FFPC. Any kind of we have a ton of Dynasty content. Any type of fantasy football coverage, like we have it covered like really in depth.
And speaking of in depth, we are going to go into Behind the Grind here a little bit later, so you're going to want to tune in for that. But hey, Evan, thank you very much for coming on here right now. And make sure to get an opportunity, head over to Establish the Run, get that draft kit today. And hey, if you want more fantasy football information, head to fantasypoints.com, enter that promo code Vipers22, and get 10% off that Fantasy Points subscription today. Now, we're going to take a quick little break here, but when we come back, we are going to go Behind the Grind with Evan Silva. See you there.